Now, Maajid Nawaz was accused of tweeting, and I'm quoting here, deranged rubbish, close quotes, about vaccines after he queried the use of the booster jab. Now he's gone further by questioning so-called COVID mandates. And I'm pleased to say that Maajid Nawaz joins us now. Good evening.
Evening, Neil. Thank you for having me.
No, I'm delighted that you're here. Now, it's such an inflammatory subject, isn't it? And there's a lot of passions running very high. But what do you mean by COVID mandates? And what are we talking about here?
So I use the general phrase COVID mandates to cover everything from mask mandates to lockdowns to no jab, no job policies, vaccine mandates. Anything where the state is involved to coerce a person's consent. Now, Article 6 of the Universal Declaration on Bioethics states very specifically that consent must be granted by the individual and can be withheld for any reason. And if it's withheld, there should be no negative repercussion, I'm paraphrasing, of withholding said consent. Now, forgive me, but sacking somebody is a negative repercussion, and therefore saying to somebody that if you don't get injected by any substance, good for you or bad for you, that's not my issue. I'm talking about principles, civil liberties. That if the state says to any individual, if you don't get injected by this particular substance that I'm telling you is good for you, you will lose your job, that's coercion. And I believe that's a crime against humanity, as has been already encoded and enshrined in our culture, in our history, in our traditions.
Why do you think we've arrived at this point? Because we are in new territory, aren't we?
Yeah. Now, let me first of all state for the record, I'm double jabbed. And for me, it's not about the vaccines per se. It's a debate as a broadcaster I had gotten involved with as a reporting on the latest developments on the jab, the science, the evidence, the efficacy. But I'm not a scientist, so I don't speak about the vaccines. I speak about the mandates and about consent and what that means. Now, in answer to your question, why I think we've ended up in this situation, I believe we're in a bit of a moment, such as the moment that historically we experienced with the invention of the Gutenberg press and the 30 Years' War. The internet has democratized access to information. The state, though it still, as we see in Canada, has a monopoly on violence, it no longer has a monopoly on the narrative and on information. And even if you think prior to the internet with the advent of the printing press and books, that was an example of the state losing a monopoly on, for example, access to the Bible. And in those days, the church and the state represented the same thing. Now, today, that effect has played out with access to the internet. So there was a narrative that we were being told to believe, and claims were made at the beginning of this health crisis, such as President Biden saying that if you get vaccinated, you will not catch COVID. He's on the record saying that. So there was a narrative, and that was the state narrative. And what's happened is that people refused to stop questioning. People refused to stop holding power to account and began speaking to each other online. And that's disrupted traditional power hierarchies, a bit like the printing press did. And what that does with that disruption is it causes unease and it causes tension and conflict. We're in that moment right now, and the state is struggling against its own people to define the narrative, in other words, to define reality.
Tom, that's a very interesting point, isn't it? That the internet, the presence of the internet has simultaneously enabled governments to do things which hitherto would have been impossible, but it has also paradoxically or given us as a general population that ability to look for our own information and not just take for granted what's coming down from the top. It has put us in a very interesting liminal zone, hasn't it?
Because we live in an age where we have active citizenship. Not everyone chooses, by the way, to take up that active citizenship, but I'm more positive about these things because, yes, we can look at the authoritarianism in Canada, but people are fighting back. People are demanding their rights. In this country, we had the Chartists, we had the suffragettes. There've been
but now what's happening is you're having the government with the likes of Facebook and Twitter trying to clamp down on anything that that doesn't fit their political narrative. But they're not, the online harms and all of that.
Yeah, but the point is they're not completely getting away with it. Why is it that England, and I say specifically here England because I think in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland we have seen more aggression, as it were, towards these types of mandates. Why is it here in England, compared to the rest of Europe, we have relatively less restrictions? That doesn't mean to say we haven't had lockdowns, we haven't had some pretty ghastly things have happened. But it's because I think we have a citizenry armed with information that is prepared to push back.
I agree. I'd agree. Our
government.
resistance here to these mandates was, in England particularly, was quite strong. But I also agree with this point. I think that the big tech giants are attempting, in particular with the Biden regime, to silence dissenting voices. I'm suffocated on Instagram. If you try and follow me on Instagram, a warning comes up and says I spread disinformation. I'm suffocated on Twitter. The online harms bill is problematic, and the Times reported that our government wants to criminalise COVID disinformation with prison time. And the problem here, of course, is as we all now have been following this for the last 2 years, something that was yesterday's disinformation became today's preponderant theory. And this is one of the reasons why there was a backlash against my own broadcasting. I was early on speaking about the lab leak in Wuhan, and at the time, people were called conspiracy theorists for speaking about that. Today, that is the preponderant theory.
Why do you think it has been different here? I think there's no denying what Tom's saying. We have held on to more freedom. It's been severely impacted and restricted for sure, but there has been some kind of determination to retain freedom that seems to be holding something of a line from the point of view of the people against what is coming down from the government.
It would be hard to put one reason on this, but I do think it's a combination of history and the nature of what it meant in England to break away, for example, during the Henry VIII's breaking away from the Catholic Church, this fiercely independent, we will stand on our own, set up our own church. There's that history there, which I believe matters more than most people give credit to. In addition, there was a fierce people's resistance to these mandates. In addition to that, this country has this, again, historical point of having resisted Nazi Germany, despising fascism and actually having learned the lessons of fascism in a way that because Churchill was standing up until the last moment before the Americans joined in against totalitarianism, there's a particular culture that, the perfect storm, if you like, that came together in England that didn't even actually come together in Wales and Scotland. We had more left-wing governments. Until this day, we have that going on there.
Do you think there are ever, could you imagine even hypothetically, circumstances where our freedoms should be restricted in the way that they have been for the greater good? Could you see that even hypothetically?
See, that's an interesting hypothetical question, and it requires the equally hypothetical threat of something that would either kill us all unless we did it together or not. And COVID simply wasn't an example of that. That's like people during the War on Terror. I was quite active, speaking both against the excesses of the War on Terror and also against extremism coming from our own community, Muslim community. Now, people used to pose a similar hypothetical to me about the ticking time bomb theory. Is it okay to torture a suspect if you know that they know that there's a bomb going off tomorrow and they won't tell you where? Can you kind of, like a 24, what's that show, 24? Jack Bauer, isn't it? Jack Bauer's
are there limits on state power? Yeah.
And so, again, in that very hypothetical example, you bring it to the real world. Imagine I'm the officer that did that, and now I have to justify myself in the real world. In the real world, there still will need to be a third party that asks me, upon what evidence did I do that, and how could I prove that I knew that person already knew where the bomb was in the first place? And once you start bringing in other people, it becomes a lot less morally ambiguous. You start realizing that actually it's very difficult even to prove that this person definitely knows where a bomb is. So you'll always end up jumping the shark. I believe it's a slippery slope. We've got to be very careful about precedents that are set.
So do you think that in this instance the government has used the wrong opportunity, which is to say COVID, to try and restructure the relationship between the state and the people?
100%. And the last time they tried this was during the War on Terror, with Blair's attempt to introduce identity cards. He's now trying again with digital ID, using COVID vaccine passports as an excuse. It's the age-old. Anyone who enjoys Star Wars, for example, watch the episode 3 in the prequels with Emperor Palpatine becoming Senator Palpatine becoming Emperor Palpatine, the kind of palace coup, the domestic takeover without the need for violence by taking over from within, right? Now, there are some people among us who attempt to use every emergency to accrue more power for the state. And the problem, of course, is if we, the people, allow the state to usurp our rights during an emergency, the state has an incentive to create an emergency to usurp our rights. And that, I believe, is the missing piece of the jigsaw when we look at everything that's happened over the last 2 years. And everything we've said turned out true, right? And the state everything they said turned out wrong. The research is there now, whether it's mask mandates, lockdowns, vaccine mandates. None of that worked the way they said it was going to work. Let's put it that way, right? That's me being reasonable. None of it worked the way they told us it was going to work. And so when we ask, where is the disinformation really coming from? And why is it coming? I'm happy that England retreated from those positions, looked to Canada, New Zealand and Australia to see what could have been if we didn't retreat. And now we have a duty, just as we did in the past, to make sure that we don't abandon the people of Canada, Australia and New Zealand and make sure we show them solidarity.
That's a good point as well, isn't it, Emily? I mean, have we, do you think, by whatever it is that we've been doing as people, by protesting and by flagging up what we think is going on and sharing this information, have we stopped this in its tracks? Or should we be looking to Canada and New Zealand and Australia and continuing to think if it's happened there, it could happen here? Or have we held it back?
I mean, I hope that we've held it back. I mean, we don't know if there's going to be another variant that crops up and then suddenly we hear the same justifications for the curtailment of our civil liberties. I mean, it's a very difficult one. We've seen just how much the government were able to shift the goalposts time and time again. We never thought we'd go back into lockdown, and there we were before Christmas, suddenly all hunkered down again. So it's really hard to predict the future, but we've got to, as you say, show some solidarity with those in Canada, with those in Australia, with those in New Zealand, who are still under the most ridiculous governments and tyranny in some ways.
Tom, why do you think it is that we're watching what's happening, or we're seeing, or if we choose to, we can see what's happening in Canada, for example. We can also see what's happening in Australia and in New Zealand. And yet Boris Johnson takes an opportunity to stand up and talk about the challenges and the threat to life facing the people of Ukraine without making even a passing reference to say anything condemnatory about what is happening in Canada. How do we interpret that absence of comment from our leaders?
Well, we talked about this earlier in terms of, I think, just the political hypocrisy, but I just want to come back to a point, and actually I very rarely leap to the defence of Boris Johnson, but he got it right in terms of this latest lockdown. He didn't go for the Omicron lockdown over Christmas, and I think one of the reasons for that, and again, call me naive, but I've got a lot of faith in our parliamentary system. We wouldn't see a Canada here, we wouldn't see a New Zealand, for the simple reason that, as we saw with the Brexit vote in 2016, there's always been a faction in Parliament, whether it's the Spartans over Brexit or actually Boris Johnson's own backbenchers, that are able to put him on notice that if he tried to push through another lockdown, another cancellation of Christmas, then he wouldn't be in the job that he's in now. And I think that's something quite, again, it's a British phenomenon, I think.
Credit where credit is due. I believe that a lot of the vitriol he's now facing is because he pulled back from this agenda. And I believe that if you look to Keir Starmer's position, it's been unwavering. He's always been in support of further and harsher measures. And of course, that carries influence. The Labour Party influences our culture. So credit where it's due. I would say that it does alarm me. If you think back to Hong Kong and how our media was all over that, right? That's what Trudeau is doing. It alarms me that mainstream media, what I'm calling these days corporatist legacy media, obviously this particular station is an exception to what we know mainstream media depicts, and they were all over Hong Kong, and they are woefully silent about Canada, and there have been since the truckers began, and there were attempts to paint some of those truckers as far-right extremists, encouraged by Trudeau. In fact, there's a Canada Broadcasting Corporation media article saying that the far-right love the word freedom. And you think, is that what we've come to, that the word freedom is now seen as a far-right?
Pejorative.
Yeah, it's unbelievable. So I do think I encourage our Prime Minister to show solidarity like we did to Hong Kong, and yes, to the people of Ukraine, minus the Azov Brigade, but like we did with Hong Kong, to show some solidarity to the people in Canada. But this brings us back to the narrative. I don't believe that with the way in which the state has monopolised the narrative, it's no longer possible to pretend that things aren't happening when we can all see them happening. I mean, because of this big tech censorship stuff, I've joined a platform, I'm in collaboration with Getter now, and I believe their CEO, Jason Miller, will be on your show in a minute. And because it's a free speech platform, I'm very, very concerned about the way they try and censor people like us who are attempting to raise the alarm online.
And what will you be doing? I think of Getter as just a means to share short messages, between people who are aware of our existence, but you must have other things.
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that I, for reasons that I can't explain for legal reasons on this show, it's no secret that I lost my broadcasting role over these sorts of conversations, right? And at LBC. So I can't go into the details there. I have announced that I've sent a legal letter to them. But, what I'll be looking to do going forward is I have a Substack where my writing goes up, and I'll be trying to host a video platform show on an alternative to YouTube called Odyssey, where I'll be basically uploading video podcasts, and it's a decentralized platform, so the videos can't be taken down. And then on Getter, I'll be putting up live streams to comment. And the three I'll be using to comment on what I believe is increasing authoritarianism coming from the state, whether it's the online harms bill, the policing bill, the human rights bill. If we look at the COVID emergency laws that we've put in place, they need to go. The state is accruing more and more power, and I believe just at the time where what we should be doing is retreating as a state from the people and allowing people to be. And that was the mistake. You see, the 30 Years' War after the printing press and the Gutenberg press was invented, the state needs to be very careful here because it's at a crossroads. We stand at a crossroads between human liberty and technocratic tyranny. And, of course, there's a power out there, a rising superpower, that would love for us to adopt their way of doing things, their culture, and that is China. And I believe we should jealously guard our own culture.